I didn't recall that we moved the Tuesday meeting to Wednesday.
this.
Oh, one over.
Good evening, everyone. I am calling our special work session meeting to order. Today is September 1st, 2021.
President Adair,
Present.
Ms. Beckerly,
Present.
Mr. Brown,
I'm here.
Mr. Cole,
Here.
Dr. Pierce,
Present.
Mr. Ragland,
Here.
Vice President Reyes.
Here.
You have a quorum, Madam President.
Thank you so much. On tonight's agenda, we are going to have another discussion with AJ Crable from the Council of Great City Schools, and we have an executive session, and then we will adjourn. Without objection, the agenda is adopted. Okay, so I will ask AJ to come on and turn it over to him.
Good evening, humans of Columbus. Great to be with you again. Excited for another round of monitoring. I've got to say, I've been spending a lot of time bragging on just how great the monitoring session with the board was the last time that we spent time together. So excited to dive back into that, continue growing that particular muscle, and really preparing the board to demonstrate what highly effective governance that's truly focused on student outcomes looks like, to be a beacon, not only for districts across the great state of Ohio, but also districts across the country who are looking for exemplars to key off of. So this evening, what I want to do is I want to first go through the monitoring practice, really very much identical to what we did the last time that we were together. And then after that, there's a bunch of other documents that are in your materials. And so I want to walk through some of those as we really continue the path of getting the board more and more prepared to be intensely focused on improving student outcomes. And so we'll dive into the rest of those documents. What you will need and what we'll spend our time focused on during this session is you'll need the document that shows what your goals are and what your interim goals are. That's the one that is a fairly attractive document that your staff has put together. In addition to that, you'll need the document titled 2021 Graduation Analysis that looks like it came from Russell Brown. And then in addition to that, the third thing that you'll need for this monitoring practice is the progress monitoring document. It's a 3-page document that we walked through last time. It starts with giving just some overviews of what is monitoring and what are some tips for being successful with it. Goes into the second page that describes what are the actual process and steps for effective monitoring. And then the third page is board self-evaluation. How did we do in our monitoring? And we'll do the same thing. We'll walk through those 3 pages just for the purpose of learning and growth. We'll go through the first one pretty quickly since we went through that in depth last time. We'll spend most of our time in a practice monitoring session around your 2021 graduation analysis data. And then we'll self-evaluate how the board performed during its monitoring practice. And then again, after we're completed with the monitoring, then we'll switch over and go through some of your other governance documents. Any questions about the items on the agenda before we get started? Questions about any of the items? All right. I have a hard time seeing you all, so I don't see
There are
any
no
questions at the
questions.
moment,
There are no questions,
but
AJ.
Perfect. And thank you, Madam Chair. As questions come up, even though I can't really see them, just feel free to let me know and we'll stop for that.
Will do.
So this evening's monitoring session, and again, just for the purpose of practice for this round, I will one more time play the role of board chair for a chunk of this, just so that each of you gets a full practice. But expect that in future sessions, practice sessions will have the board chair actually chair it so that I can offer some coaching in real time. But then it'll also make sense to have some other folks practice as well so that you can begin to level up your skill set. So this evening's monitoring conversation focuses on the board's goal around closing opportunity gaps and really looking at the percentage of four-year graduation cohorts who complete state and district graduation requirements. And so we're going to deep dive into that. So before we do so, first I want to look at the first page of that progress monitoring document. And so if you don't have that out yet, go ahead and pull that out. That's the document that says progress monitoring student outcomes. And just to go through the entire first page all at once, just as a way of review, board members, what is one thing on this document, the first page of this document, that really jumps out at you as you're thinking about the practice of being effective with monitoring? Okay, I'm sorry, it occurs to me that I didn't provide you with the first page of this document. And so I'll read through a few of these, the titles of some of these items. And if there's something that has really stood out for you last time or that you want some more explanation about, that we can dive into that. And so in the monitoring, the first section on the first page describes that there are really three main questions, like to what extent does reality for students match the expectations of the board? And when that reality isn't being met, is there at least evidence that there's growth toward that, the reality for students matching the expectations of the board? And when we don't see growth, do we at least see a appropriately aggressive plan from the superintendent for how to move from where we are to actually causing there to be growth? So those are the three big questions in the back of your mind as you're going through monitoring. Any questions board members have about board members or staff who report to the board? Any questions you all have about why we're monitoring or any of those three questions? The extent to which
Could you
reality for
repeat them?
students
Yeah.
matches the extent to which reality for students matches the expectations of the board. And when that's not the case, the extent to which there's evidence of growth that is moving the reality of students in the direction of the expectation of the board. And when we don't see growth, do we at least see a appropriately aggressive plan from the superintendent on how to create growth for our students? Those are the three big questions that you're wrestling with that the process of monitoring is intended to help shine light on. Any questions about why we monitor?
No one appears to have any questions.
The next section asks, why is monitoring beneficial? How is it beneficial? And as you recall, we had a conversation about four key ideas. One, it's an opportunity for the board to lead by example, to really show that we have, in this school system, we have honest conversations about what is and isn't working for students and what management's response to that reality is. It's about clarifying strategies and creating an opportunity for the community and the staff to have a really deep understanding of what are the specific strategic approaches the school system is taking to try to move student performance. It's about communicating expectations, making it clear to folks, these are the things that our community values and really wants to see our students know and be able to do. And this is the extent to which students need to grow in that area. And then finally, why is monitoring beneficial? Fourth reason, this is about formative evaluation. It's about looking at the board's employees and asking to what extent are they making progress in the areas that the board has tasked them with. So these are four big ideas that we covered around how is monitoring beneficial. Any questions about any of those four areas? Questions or comments about those four areas? Lead by example, clarify the strategies, communicate expectations, formative evaluation.
There are no questions or comments.
And then finally, tips for effective monitoring. We spent a fair amount of time in this area. We talked about the first tip is do your homework. Actually read the monitoring report in advance and really have prepared questions in advance. So don't show up to a monitoring conversation, having that be the first time that you've actually looked at the monitoring report and the first time that you started developing questions. That is horrible governance practice and describes board behavior that really is not prioritizing the well-being of the students. You want to come prepared Do your homework in advance. The second tip was understanding reality, is just be clear that the intention of this is to get clear about what is the reality for students, not what do I want the reality to be, like what is the reality? And so it's actually not useful to try to sugarcoat or dance around or to try to obfuscate undesirable data. Like, we need to know the real for students. What is the reality for students, not the make-believe. The intention is to get into what is really happening. And part of the board's role in ensuring that is that when you get the reality, is that you don't immediately shoot the messenger. That you need to be able to handle the fact that the reality is the reality, and then ask the hard questions that create accountability, not go into demonstrations of judgment and casting aspersions that actually inspires the staff to play hide the ball in the future. We really want to create a safe space for having an honest conversation about what's working, what's not working. This third tip for effective monitoring, keep the conversation going. If things aren't exactly what they need to be, instead of shutting things down, look for ways to just extend the conversation. Maybe we need to come back to this next month instead. Fourth tip, no gotcha governance. Like, if you have your information in advance and you prepared it in advance, communicate that with your superintendent in advance. If there are major questions that you have, ask those in advance. In particular, as you see in the self-evaluation, there are three types of questions. There are ones around strategy. You should always expect your staff, particularly your senior executives, to know what is the strategy that we are deploying to make a difference on the performance of our students. But then beneath strategic questions, there are often tactical questions that get into, how are things being implemented? You shouldn't expect your superintendent to know how all, 10,000 of your employees, exactly what they're doing at any given moment on any given day. It's just not a reasonable expectation. So as you get into more tactical questions, today, as I'm role playing, chairing the meeting, and in the future, as others are chairing monitoring conversations, the chair should be listening for, is this a strategic question, or is this really more of a tactical question that doesn't really fit into the monitoring conversation nearly as much? Look for those strategic, what is our overall vision and plan for how we're accomplishing things, not the tactical of which specific employee and which specific thing is being done on which specific day. And then even below that are more technical questions. These dig into, okay, what is the exact psychometric evaluation conducted for this particular assessment, and how does it align with this goal? And just like tactical questions, technical questions are perfectly legitimate questions, but if you spring them on your chief executives in the middle of a board meeting, that feels like gotcha governance. Like, if you want to know answers to technical and tactical questions, send them in advance so that your staff is prepared to answer them. As a board chair, when you hear those questions and they weren't sent in advance, you should go ahead and hit the pause button on that and say, that's a great question. Madam Superintendent, please prepare to have an answer to that and send it out in a future Friday packet. That's how whoever is chairing the meeting should handle tactical and technical questions, so it doesn't feel like this is about playing gotcha on the dais. And then the final tip for effective monitoring, this is not the opportunity for advice offering. This is the opportunity to figure out what does our staff actually know and what do they actually plan to do. Not the opportunity or the occasion for telling them what they should know and telling them what they should do. That's fairly worthless in this context for this as a formative evaluation of staff. There are certainly other opportunities where the benefit of your infinite wisdom and knowledge can be deployed to staff. Monitoring isn't the time for it. And so that's the fifth effective monitoring tip, is this is not the opportunity to offer advice on what staff should or shouldn't do. This is the time to figure out, what does staff know? What do they actually believe, and what do they actually intend to do? So those are the 5 key tips for effective monitoring. Any questions about any of those 5 tips? Questions or comments about those?
There are no questions or comments, AJ.
I feel like I'm doing something wrong. This is normally a chatty
I think
bunch.
we are just so on board and just ready to jump in.
Just ready to jump in. All right, well then, with that being the case, we dive in. So now the document that you do have in front of you has a second page of it that has before monitoring, during monitoring, and then after monitoring. And so I will just dive in, and we'll begin our role play right now. All right, board, our next item of business is monitoring our goal number 3. You all have in front of you the monitoring report that was submitted. The first thing to get clear about is, does this monitoring report clearly show which of our goals is being monitored?
And AJ, can I ask a question, please? Since it's
This is time for questions and
yeah.
comments.
So, because we did a presentation during our last practice with a piece of this data, and this practice will be with the entire cohort. I did add a presentation by the and this practice will be with the entire cohort. I did add a presentation by the team, and the team is prepared to do a brief presentation that will accompany the executive summary that they.
Excellent. So this brings us to our first timeout in the role play.
Yeah.
The intention of monitoring is really formative evaluation. It's a conversation between the board and the board's direct reports.
Correct.
And so when we get into monitoring, particularly when we're monitoring academic performance, the goals, this is really a conversation between the board and the superintendent, not a conversation between the board and the superintendent's staff.
Correct.
And so that's something to calibrate around and be prepared for, is that the primary conversation, the monitoring report should be a report that comes from the superintendent to the board, and the conversation should be a conversation between the superintendent and the board. So for senior staff members cabinet members who are with us today, what this means as a practical matter is you're going to have to set your boss up for success.
Correct.
That generally means that in advance of a monitoring session, it's not, as I said a minute ago, it's not reasonable to expect the superintendent to have a lot of tactical and technical level details on implementation. I mean, that's literally why you all have jobs, so she doesn't have to, so that she can be focused more at a strategic level. But in advance of a monitoring session, then, as cabinet members, you'll want to make sure that you've properly briefed her on any absolutely vital, or urgent issues relating to tactically what the district is currently doing relative to the report that's being monitored. In addition, monitoring conversations are intended to be exactly that, conversations. And so they typically do not have a presentation accompanying them. It's not unusual for the superintendent to introduce the data and offer some perspective around it. But in terms of a formal presentation, other than presenting the data and offering whatever commentary is necessary to help contextualize the data for the board, that tends to be the extent of the formal presentation. And then from there, the superintendent and the board have a conversation about what's going on with the data and, and what is the administration's response to it.
Right.
And so that is a significant issue to calibrate around, and that this is really a conversation intended for the board chair and for the superintendent to really dive, or for the board and the superintendent to really dive into this conversation together. Similarly, when there is monitoring around some of the financial guardrails, that's most likely going to be a conversation between the board and the treasurer, not a conversation between the board and the treasurer's staff. And so if there are things that Stan needs to brush up on, he needs to do that in advance of showing up at the party. He needs to be come ready to dance. And so that is just kind of one quirk of monitoring that kind of takes people a little bit by surprise. That being said, in the last session, Madam Superintendent, you did an exceptional job. It was really a great session.
So, but AJ, the reason why I want to give you some context is because when we were establishing this protocol, we knew that we needed to give the board the information at least a month in advance, right? And that would include a presentation. It would give them a time to maybe receive a video that we can record, but give them all of that information so they can give us the questions, et cetera. So I thought that for this session, since they just received this information yesterday, right?
Gotcha.
Right, and it's an extension from what they received prior, that as we practice, that they would have, we kind of condense it, we condense it all in one, during this practice session. So we know that in the future that this is not the protocol, but this is important because there's some pieces about this data that they didn't have in the previous practice session.
Oh, yeah, gotcha.
Gotcha.
So essentially what you're thinking is not only is the board getting opportunity to practice, but this is also a practice round for the staff of what's the type of thing
Exactly.
that would be provided to the board in advance.
Yes.
Got it. All right, well,
Does that make sense?
let us
Okay.
Okay, hold on, though.
extend
There are
the-
there are two questions on the floor. Board Member Cole and Board Member Ragland.
Thank you, Madam President. First question is in the spirit of being on pause and not in the monitoring conversation. I want to preface with that. One is particularly on this report here, that is the executive summary above that. Is there some way for us to assign that to the goal so we know off the jump what we're looking at? I think that'd be very helpful if we add the goal that we're actually monitoring in the conversation to this sheet here. The same way that we typically do on agenda or agenda review, that we know what goals are tied to what based on the legislation, if I'm making sense.
Right. So, if you look under, on this one sheet that has.
Right, I see that one.
So I see what you're saying.
For the
put it on all
executive
the
summary,
documents.
it
Yes,
should
I
be
agree.
continuous through everything.
Thank you. That's a good call out. Thank you.
Board Member Ragland?
No, I'm cool, thank you.
Oh, you don't have a question? Board Member Beckerly?
I just have a question. Does the board feel like it needs a presentation from staff? Because, the report was pretty straightforward. Did everybody have a chance to look
Well,
at it?
I think that she's saying that they want to
Okay,
practice.
okay, never mind.
Because this is what
Got
we
it.
would get, and they just want to get our reaction to it to
Right.
also
Because
make sure.
if we're gonna
Feedback.
if we're gonna present this stuff to you guys in a month in advance and it's not right, how do we, and this is all
Yeah.
new, so
Okay.
it would give us the opportunity to get the information. And
So the
you-
answer in real life would be no. We would not need a
That's the-
presentation.
Right.
Right.
That's correct.
Because
you
we
would've
would
already
have
received
it in advance, and we would have done our homework, asking all the questions.
Right,
And
see,
dive into
and
the
another
data.
thing, just even like the questions, the only person that sent us questions was Carol, right? Which is good. So tonight, we don't expect any other questions other than the questions that Carol sent.
Okay.
And we were able to, look at those questions and say, okay, here are the questions that Carol sent regarding the data. But it was all, we recognize it was all late, right?
Yeah.
Moving forward, you would have it all.
Yeah, you didn't have any time to answer my
Right, you would have it in a
Yes.
month, you
True.
would have it, we're able to look at it, we go back and, go back to those technical and tactical questions and make sure that when we have the conversation, those questions are answered. So it gives us an opportunity to practice on it, so we make sure that when we are live and we're having that conversation, the information that I need is there, yeah, so we can have, yeah.
Dr. Pierce?
I just have a point of clarification. So, Dr. Dixon, you and I spoke at length, and I gave you my questions during a call, particularly the Dr. Pierce type of questions, I guess. So, were you tracking those? Do I need to send those via email?
Right, so we always send the questions in the emails that we know which questions that board members may, I know the board members and know you and know what questions that you may ask that we would put here as part of the presentation. But, when we stated in a typical, when this is real, you have your information, you send those questions, we will make sure that those questions are answered as part of our presentation.
Got
We're
you.
still practicing tonight.
So the 2 questions that I gave you, you still want those via email as opposed to
Please,
just
yes.
telephone? Okay.
Yes, yeah. We can always talk about them, but just always follow up in writing, because what I'll do if I either put them here in the board notebook, or Misty is helping, making sure that we.
And remember, we talked
Excellent.
about having them in writing so that they could also be published.
Yep.
So we have to, because Misty or whoever the board liaison would then publish them. So then the community can see what the questions were as well. Remember Raglan?
Yes, my question concerns the flow of the conversation between the superintendent and the board, and particularly the exclusion of staff in that conversation. If there's a situation where a staff member has the answer to a question from the board member, why is there reluctance to include that staff member at that particular time? I think for me, understanding that we only meet twice a month, if there's a question that a staff member has that's available to be answered at that moment, my preference as a board member would be to not wait for the sake of waiting, but to, if the superintendent has a staff member that's on standby, that's ready to answer that, then have them answer the question. Is there a specific reason why you're recommending that be our practice?
So if I could, because I was going to say, when we get to this monitoring calendar, and I would know exactly when to present the data to you, right? So the questions, and AJ, this is still a training, so let me know if my understanding is correct. So just hypothetically, in January of every year, we discuss graduation, right? So in January, we're going to discuss it. In December, you have all of your data. So you have it a month in advance. And then you will provide the questions to me. And then, so the day of the monitoring discussion, I have all of my information from my team. Your questions are already being considered, so that it shouldn't be questions that are gotcha questions, or that I shouldn't have that I wouldn't have known prior. Does that make sense? Because we're all looking at the same data, right? And in timely fashion, and it's coming every year in January, graduation day. That's my understanding of this monitoring protocol. Is that correct, AJ?
Yeah, definitely when it comes to strategic level questions, if your superintendent has to defer to her staff to understand what the district's strategy is for improving performance relative to your goals, that is a red flag. So she shouldn't have to rely on them to understand what the strategy is. Now, to get into the really detailed nitty-gritty, those are what I would describe as the tactical level questions or technical level questions. Yeah, you shouldn't expect her to know that, because that's not what you're paying her to do. That's literally what she's paying them to do. And so for those sort of things, if it's important to you that those are included in the conversation, then as a board member, what she said is exactly spot on. You will want to provide those questions in advance so that she can be prepared to respond to some of those tactical level or technical level questions. But if they get below the level of strategy and she was not prepared for that, the best use of your time in monitoring, and again, this is just for monitoring conversations, this is not all conversations, but just for monitoring, the best use of your time is to get more clarity about the data, what is reality for students, as well as get more clarity around what does our superintendent believe the data means, and what is her vision for how best to respond to the data. And so there's not an absolute prohibition here. If for some reason she thinks something would be really valuable, if she's kind of knee deep in this conversation with the board, but she comes to a point like, you know what would be really, really valuable is to hear a little bit more detail in the weeds on this, then she's welcome to pull in one of her staff.
Right.
but that should be the exception, not at all the rule. This isn't intended to be a conversation between her employees and the board. It's intended to be a conversation between her and the board.
So the prohibition is much more about presentations.
Yeah, right.
Oh yeah, no.
I think that's where the
that
prohibition
part,
comes in,
what I mentioned
right.
earlier was, we're not. You're not here to hear presentations from cabinet members.
Right.
You're here to have a conversation with your superintendent.
Yeah. So those presentations, we won't do those any longer.
That's correct.
So what we're doing, we want to make sure that this presentation meets your expectations. So when we're recording and putting these presentations together, what you have is what you need.
The data, that's essentially the data package you're giving us
Exactly.
ahead of time.
Correct. Exactly.
Sorry, I'm talking out of turn.
Other questions or comments? This is really helpful to, it's a new process, and so it's going to take a little bit of time to get clarity and to work out the wrinkles. That's why we're practicing before we actually start this for real. Other questions or comments about the process of monitoring?
Board Member Beckerly has another question.
Yeah, it's a question / comment, or I just want you to confirm, AJ. The purpose of the questions ahead of time, getting our questions to the superintendent and staff ahead of time, is to avoid got you and to make sure that the discussion is as thorough and informative and helpful as possible. But it's possible a question can come up that wasn't gotten to you ahead of time. I mean, it's not a...
Absolutely.
Right,
Right.
okay.
Right, as long
And
as
then-
it's pertaining to the strategy.
Right.
If it's too technical, that's when we can put a pin in it and give it back to her to answer in writing.
Right.
And to the extent that questions come up the day of that didn't come up before, then we're skirting very close to what AJ said last time, which is like just stuck in my head. Like, if you're not prepared to not have your question ahead of time and thought this through, and it comes up at the monitoring session, you still get to ask, but then you have to go home and ask yourself why you weren't prepared and you didn't care enough about kids to be prepared ahead of time. I've had nightmares about that, but anyway, okay. Just saying. Like, I'm so afraid to not be prepared now.
This is a powerful opportunity for the board to set culture for the organization, and describe through its behavior, here's what it looks like in our school system to care about what's possible for students and to live into that caring and how we show up in conversations about how our students are doing and what our response to that is. And in the same way that when the superintendent has conversations like this with the principals, that you want her and the principals to show up ready, to go to war for kids and to make sure that, that they have the best version of themselves available for the children. In the same way that you want principals and teachers, when they're having conversations in their data teams about what's possible for students, that you want them to be fully prepared. You want to set the norm, create the culture for your school system, that these conversations matter and that we give them the attention in advance that our most meaningful conversations deserve. It's really this powerful opportunity to help set cultural norms and expectations in the school system. And as board members, I just invite you to lean into that possibility with everything you got.
Hold on, Board Member Cole, and then I can come back to you, Board Member Beckerly.
Thank you, Madam President. There are two particular sections that come to mind here when I'm thinking about these type of tactical questions that could possibly arise that might have been, even in the moment, almost like an epiphany. Again, not an excuse to divert from being prepared. I think all of us come to the table prepared. That's true. But when we're thinking about the why and how section, isn't that an opportunity to document a publicly made question by the board to the superintendent to ask something tactical that we might have missed in the preparation stage of the meeting? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So we can utilize these two opportunities in the monitoring conversation. Even if she can't answer them in the moment, she can at least very publicly document there that the question was asked.
Absolutely.
Because I have a colleague who's asked public questions that she had privately in dialogue, right? but there wasn't an answering of that question at the last board meeting. So I just want to
Yeah.
know that we can utilize these two sections here to have those tactical dialogues.
Yes, yeah. The only point of my advising was just to level set on expectations. That you
Gotcha.
shouldn't expect her, to have answers of, hey, what's happening in this classroom in this school on this day? She won't know the answer to that. But if you ask that question, then absolutely she can capture that, and then an appropriate future Friday packet or something else can be responsive to it. Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you know, I mean, this is the point of talking about it. We realize it's a tactical question, and so you can preface it with,
This is a
Madam
tactical
Superintendent, I don't
question.
expect you to answer this. I have a tactical question. Here it is. Please add it to the list.
Right.
And then the last thing, what we did too, if you look at your monitoring, we even made sure the questions were applicable to this data set.
Right.
Because the questions from the monitoring of student outcomes, that doesn't
Last time.
necessarily fit with this data set that you have right now. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, some of the questions, what's not working in this, we would know because this data is just one group of, just the seniors, right? So we kind of made sure that we made some changes to help make sure that we keep the dialogue going as we practice.
And that's great, by
Yeah.
the way. Thank you for doing that.
And then-
Other questions or comments
Board
before we
Member
dive back
Broccoli,
into?
yes.
And just the one thing about AJ, what AJ said about establishing culture and climate, I just think that if we show this as a safe space, that is critical to changing the climate and the culture throughout the organization. And so we have to be loud and proud about being safe and being collaborative.
Yeah, this is worth noting because this comes up often in monitoring. If you want to create a safe space for teachers to beat up on children, or for principals to beat up on teachers, or for the superintendent to beat up on principals, you can create a safe space by using monitoring as the opportunity to beat up on the superintendent. But the converse is also accurate. If you want to create a safe space for teachers to have nurturing conversations about performance and growth with students,
Right.
then you want to create a safe space. Then you want there to be a safe space for principals to have that conversation with teachers, and for the superintendent to have that conversation with principals. And your access to creating the culture of that safe space is how you have a monitoring conversation with your superintendent. And so that is absolutely a critical part because it's a school system. Like we don't expect children to know everything, otherwise we wouldn't be to school. We expect there to be growth opportunities literally every single day in our classrooms. And this is an opportunity for the board to demonstrate through practice, what does it look like to lean into growth opportunities, to have meaningful and direct conversations. Like if little AJ can't read, it doesn't do us any benefit to lie to him and pretend that he can. Like, hey, you know what? We haven't yet mastered these particular vowel sounds. But with your hard work and our support, we're going to get you there. We're going to master these vowel sounds. In the same way, the board can model that behavior through its monitoring work. Hey, it's clear that at our graduation data, we're not there yet. And superintendent, we need to hear, what your strategy is. But with your hard work and our support, we know that we're going to get there.
Board Member Ragland.
AJ, who is doing this effectively now that we can look at? I mean, I understand we're going through this practice phase, and I may have asked you this before, but do you have examples of districts that we can maybe look in on as good examples of this in action?
Yeah, this question came up last time, and my promise to you then is the same promise to you now. Let's get some practice under our belt. Actually, get really deep into this several times so that you know exactly kind of what works and what doesn't work for you all. And then once we've practiced it a few times, I've actually got some clips lined up that I'll share with you all, and then you all can watch those. And then you'll be in a position to compare and contrast. Okay, here's what we did, and now I see what they're doing. But it's going to work out much better for you when you have some actual lived experience to compare what you're seeing against, because then the context will help it make more sense and be more fruitful. So yes, I do have some clips lined up for you of some monitoring sessions from other places. And after we get through a few more practice rounds, absolutely, I stand by my previous commitment that I'll share those with you.
Like there are no
Other
more.
questions or comments before we dive back in?
I think we're good to dive back in.
All right, so it sounds like before we get into the live action part of the monitoring practice, the staff are going to practice their role in sending out prep materials. So, Madam Superintendent, I'll hand it over to you. Can you give me a sense of how much time your staff is going to take? Like,
think it's only-
we don't need
Yeah.
the for real version of this.
Right. I think it's 7 minutes, it's 7 to 10. It's not, it's not a long presentation
All
at
right, do your
all.
thing.
I think maybe 7 to 10 minutes, I think, of what it is. So we will send it over to Dr. Brown, Kira, and Kenny.
Hi, everyone. Can we put up the PowerPoint? Great, thank you. All right, so thank you for this opportunity for us to practice. This presentation will describe the performance of the entire 2020-2021 graduation cohort. Next slide. We will also hear directly from families and then share our collaborative next steps for moving the district forward. And I'll quickly pass it over to Dr. Brown to review the data with us.
Okay, next slide, please. So, can we back up one slide? Thank you. I'm pleased to have additional opportunity to expand upon that conversation that we started about the graduation rate and the impact of the summer school on graduation. But as we begin this conversation, I think I'd be remiss not to mention that, this is the first cohort of students to have spent over a year of their high school experience under the conditions of the pandemic. And we know, and there's been a lot of research out there, particularly in the lower grades, that the pandemic's had a substantial impact on student experiences and has created challenges for learning opportunities. And while there's been a lot of research on that in the lower grades, it would be unreasonable not to have to expect that to have some impact on our high school students as well. So the last time that we were here and got together, we talked about the summer school and summer grads, and now we're just going to put this and fold this back into the overall graduation rate. Ohio uses an adjusted cohort model to calculate graduation. It's calculated by dividing the number of on-time and early graduates by the number of students in the adjusted cohort. And cohorts based on students who entered ninth grade 4 years ago, and it's adjusted by adding students who enter our system later in ninth grade or in any of the subsequent 3 years of high school, and students who transfer to another system or immigrate to another country are removed from the cohort. So that cohort number is always changing a little bit over time as students come in and out. So our final adjusted cohort as of August 24th has 2,961 students in it. At the conclusion of the summer program, we had 2,356 on-time graduates, producing a graduation rate of 79.57%. This is a decline in the benchmark of 1.7 percentage points from the pre-pandemic graduation rate of 81.3. Next slide, please. So this breaks down our graduates racially and gets at the idea of who our graduates were. And the outcomes based on race were varied. And so multiracial white and black students showed declines in their graduation rate, with multiracial students having shown the largest decline in graduation rate of 6.2 percentage points. On the other hand, there were increases in the graduation rate for American Indian, Hispanic, and Asian American Pacific Islander students. And in fact, our American Indian students had a greater than 10 percentage point increase, and our Hispanic students had an over 6.4 percentage point increase as well, topping 70% graduation rate for our Hispanic population for only the second time since the cohort model was put in place. And finally, I'd like to mention our emergent bilingual students, because they also showed improvement. And this is actually one of our most vulnerable populations. they actually posted the highest graduation rate for the student group since the inception of the cohort model in Ohio. A graduation rate that is actually over twice that was observed only 5 years ago. Next slide, please. This provides a regional breakdown of the graduates based on the region for the school for which the student attended. As we go down this road a little bit further, I think it's going to be important to look at this a little different way as well, and look at it based on the region where a student lives as well, to give a more complete picture of the performance for the city as a whole. So, now we've talked a little bit about our graduates. Why don't we talk a little bit about the students that haven't completed yet, and what, again, is going on with those. Next slide, please. So again, the pandemic put a tremendous strain on the graduating class of 2021, and really brought into focus the importance of relationships and connection for our students. The chart on this slide shows the withdrawals by year. And so when you think about a graduation, if you think about it as a pie, every year with these withdrawals, you're seeing a little wedge of that pie taken away. And so in total, by the end, there were 10.7% of the cohort that had withdrawn before the conclusion of the summer of their senior year. This number is actually lower than what was in place pre-pandemic. And the reason it's lower is we actually have more kids who are still engaged. Columbus City Schools is better able to engage and retain students and continue to have a larger pool of students who are continuing to work to complete their requirements for graduation. So again, if you think about that as a pie, if you add up the grad rate minus the withdrawals and look at that 9.7% left, that's 100%, that's the whole. And so we have that 9.7% who are still engaged, those 289. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Mr. Lee, who's going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with those 289.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. First off, we are committed to working with members of the 2021 cohort to make sure that even though they didn't make it across the graduation stage in June or August, that we continue to work with them and get them across this stage as soon as possible. The pool that remains of the 289 students are very representative of the cohort as a whole, and a solid representation of students who receive both special education services as well as emergent bilingual students. We actually had a video prepared where we interviewed some families that across represented a good spectrum of the population of Columbus City Schools, but due to time constraints, we'll make sure that the video gets in the hands of board members, because we feel like this video really adds some important context to the numbers, the data sets that Dr. Brown put together. It really adds a story that's really important to share, and we'll make sure that the board members have that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kira.
That's going to be a little hard.
No, because of
Skipping time.
Yeah.
Okay, then go ahead and do the slide. I can do it right here.
That's it.
Okay, so Dr. Dixon always challenges us to articulate what we are going to stop doing and what we're going to start doing. And based on our successes from this summer, and particularly,
Oh, put the slide back.
yeah, I need a slide, sorry guys. And particularly our successes with our summer graduates and summer experiences, the things we know we're going to start doing and continue doing is really that individual and small group support.
Yep.
Things like tutoring, reaching out. It was so powerful, and what you hear from the video are relationships that our ELL department particularly does so well in supporting our students and families. One of the things we're going to really focus on doing for our 289 students that are still engaged in that 5th year is we've never had a mid-year graduation before, and we're going to institute that. Those students are already getting targeted outreach. There are individual plans for every student already made. We have a student in the BCAP lab today.
Yeah.
So that's really exciting. We're also going to start graduation tracking, and I'll show you a little bit about what that will look like. It's different graduation tracking. We have a new tool that we purchased at the district and invested in, so I'll talk about that in a second. One of the things we're going to stop doing is this one-size-fits-all. communication piece. One of the moms in the video, and I encourage you to watch it, said that even though she knows that it's hard for teachers to continue to communicate, it was so powerful, and it really kept her graduate and their family on track. And that's something that we want to replicate everywhere. The ELL department does it well, then specialized instruction, we can do it well too. Next slide. So this is a look at the graduation tracker that we're using. It's called Schoollinks. This is a school look. We can also see the data at a district level and down to an individual student level. So this will show you as a cohort, graduate cohort, whether they're on track or off track, and then some specifics regarding course completion as a whole. All of this is not CCS data. This is just demo data. Next slide. This allows us to look at the graduation tracking of the seal, which we know is a large part of our graduation work in preparing our students for graduation. So this will break it down by those seals. Next slide. And this is what an individual student profile might look like in Schoollinks. We are going to start doing this in 6th grade. So our students will have a plan and tracking capabilities that we will monitor. In addition to this, all of our counselors, we have hired just over 20 more counselors this summer to help support this work. In really monitoring and planning for our graduates. And then this individual tracking sheet can also be converted into our caregiver and parent form that they need to sign. So it's all in one single place and allows that collaborative and that communication piece that we know is so important with our parents. So with that, we're ready to take questions. We're excited to continue our work and really start the practices in capital.
So thank you. So that was the presentation, and then that would be a part of the packet that you would get. It would be videotaped, and you would get that along with the data. And if we need to add some additional information from that, just let me know, make a note, and then we will add to the presentations. Right? Okay.
Dr.
Just as a quick,
Did you? Looks like we have some comments right now about it. Is that okay? Or did?
yeah, that's actually what I was going to
Oh,
ask.
okay.
Just
Yeah.
if we could do a quick round of what worked, what didn't work, just to offer some feedback to your staff.
Dr. Pierce.
So what would be helpful is with the introduction of the new software piece, that there was an explanation of how that currently connects and relates to the systems that we already have. We have a number of systems that are used by different schools and different partners that we work with. So understanding how this new tracking system will interface with the systems that I know ICANN is using, for example, with the systems that some of our partners might be using would be extremely helpful. Understanding then how the parents are going to get that information. So I think that's coming from the assumption that our parents have working emails and are checking emails. What about families that aren't? So an explanation around how you all see the feasibility and the effectiveness of these systems rolling out would also be extremely helpful.
Did anybody else have?
This is just feedback on the presentation.
Rebecca Lee.
Can you go back to the slide where it was the stop doing and keep on doing slide? Like in terms of data that we want to really dig into, like these are all really wonderful, wonderful things. But I think that this monitoring to be effective, there has to be, so for example, communication. Well, our community, small group and individual engagement. I think we need to see, or targeted outreach, let's go with that one. Somehow, data that shows, if this is about graduation, say, you know, the categories of kids that are, you know, attendance is regular, attendance is spotty, attendance is not at all. How many times did we reach out? How did we reach out? Was it text? Was it phone calls? Was it knocks on the door? And obviously, we're not going to see that for 2,000 kids, but some way to track the how. So then you can tie that back to what worked and what didn't work. Because I think a lot of things worked this summer. A boatload, and actually in the spring, too. You know, and I'm guessing it had to do with the graduation coaches. I think that was kind of a new thing, and they seem to really, you know. But whatever it is, we need to see more than just what you're doing. We want to see the how it's doing and, how, you know, what's working, what isn't working. You can highlight it, like, you know, different ways to really develop a sense of it's being implemented with fidelity. And how do you demonstrate that? And I, you know, there are examples of monitoring reports and things that we can show you that you see. You know, and they'll even be color coded, like, you know, these many times, this many times, this, you know, whatever. So and I'm happy to have further conversation about, but I think that's the level of detail we really need to be getting to.
Remember Ragland and Cole?
Yeah, I guess my question, I think AJ would probably help me with this more than anything. I'm conceptually, I don't know if this is the appropriate time to ask my question. It is really about the future, but it concerns some of the data that's here, and particularly the software. And so, is this an inappropriate time to ask the question about that, or?
This is feedback, so.
So I think, you know what, that's a good question. So I think that, so if, let's pretend we got this in advance, right?
Right.
So this is your question. So when do you get to ask questions about the presentation is your question? Is that your question? And then you can ask the actual question.
And what
so they
kind
know
of
it.
question, too? I
Yeah,
guess.
so my question is about the school link software specifically, and whether or not it has the capacity to track students after graduation.
So that would be something you'd submit
Yeah.
in writing.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of a question that, based on seeing the presentation in advance, that's a perfect example of a question to submit in writing in advance, so that somebody has time to track down the answer.
Okay.
Cole and then Reyes.
Thank you, Madam President. My question, and thank you for the presentation, the added context. When we're looking, can you go back to that slide that showed the schooling slide? Can we go back to that?
Well, go up
That's the moving forward.
forward. Yeah. There you go.
Now, I can't see this very well, but in that data, do we have the ability to track student accolades, National Honor Society, specializations, and are we utilizing this platform to do just that?
Yeah, so this platform is new. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah.
I think that would be great. I just want to say that very quickly, that one of our greatest sell points, you know, that we share with any number of people is how well we are tracking our kids, how prepared they are to come into workforce. I just think that, or college or whatever, I just think tracking those accolades is an exceptional added layer for us to have a deeper context into who that portrait of a graduate is. I'll make it simple.
And to that point, if I can make this comment too, one of the reasons why we needed a new tracking document, because currently we're tracking kids at the end, right? We're looking at kids, we're putting resources at, you know, the juniors, they're not getting ready, you know, who's not on track as they get to senior year. I mean, but we're saying if we're gonna do this well, and we will, we have to start tracking early, right? And start it, so it is sixth grade, and we have a system that then everyone is using the same platform. And then think about what Dr. Pierce said earlier, you know, would this particular platform talk and speak to the other platforms that our partners will be using for communities and schools? I know I can, City Year, so that we have the same data. Because what we're also finding too with our partners is if you're working and you're seeing success with 500 kids, are those 500 kids getting resources from City Year, I know I can, and CIS, right? You know, so we're able to really track that data, have some other deeper conversations about what some trends that we're seeing, but it is our data with other, our partners. Also, maybe, you know, we can link to it and get some other feedback.
So if I may, I want to observe where we are in the process. Right now, the thing that's most useful is to offer staff kind of what worked, what didn't work in terms of the presentation. Right now, we're getting into the content of the presentation, and that's we'll dive into when we actually do the monitoring practice.
Thank you.
The other thing that I would present you to as you're reflecting on the questions that are being asked, do these questions help us better understand where student performance is right now, and what administration's response to it is? So far, the questions I've heard definitely don't score on the former question, maybe kind of score on the latter. And so they feel a little bit more in the tactical realm. So they are the perfect type of questions to ask in advance. They're not the type of questions I generally encourage to ask during the monitoring session. The other thing that I would surface is the last question felt very advice giving. And so I think, again, that's the type of question that I think better works in advance, but is not the type of question that I would encourage you to lead with in the actual monitoring conversation.
I agree to an extent with you, AJ. Yes, I do think that I tried to slip in a wise counsel, so I will admit that.
I feel you.
Just practice.
Right.
Practice.
Just pin that on me like prom night. But what I will say, is that the initial question really was designed to get a deeper understanding of that student.
The what?
Or the what
Right,
that
right.
makes our students exceptional, and where we're taking a look at that. So it was along the lines of what you first stated, but I will wear the T-shirt for. I did cheat.
Okay, we have some additional questions from Reyes and then Pierce.
So, going back to, I think one of the questions you asked us was what was missing from the presentation. So I thought that's where we were going. So I
Yes,
do have, I felt like there was a lot of data, but I still felt like there was a lot of whys missing. Like, why did they perform? Why did they do better? Why did they decrease? Even in the narrative, so I was looking for it in the narrative, right? If you missed it if I didn't hear it in the presentation, I was looking at it from the narrative. And I kept hearing bilingual students and multilingual students, and when I looked at the racial composition, I'm looking at I don't know, I just there was a lot of numbers given to me, but I didn't know why they were moving up, why were they moving down.
Okay.
So I felt that was a little missing in the narrative piece. I think we asked about interventions in the past, and I can think goes a little bit to what Carol was saying, like what interventions were working. And I'm assuming we may see that once you get this tracking tool on. You're saying that some students are getting 5, 6 different interventions. I'm making the assumption that you're gonna show us why those people, this kid had 5 interventions, therefore that's why he or she is a top student, while this student didn't receive as many. And I would assume that you would come back with the why that happened.
Or even these 3 interventions really worked and this one didn't.
Right,
So we're scrapping that one.
these partners worked and these partners didn't.
True.
So,
Right.
so, so we asked what's missing. I'm wondering if
Right.
that's gonna be included, in the future. And I'm also wondering, since we are starting the new year, we're talking about virtual or on, and in person, right? Are you going to be dividing the data in that form? It's like, some kids, I mean, we talked all about COVID, where kids were at home and stuck to the computer, and why they may not have performed as well. And we made a statement saying that now that we bring them into the school, they're gonna perform better. So I would make an assumption that when you present this data, or any student data, I would be looking for, why are they doing better in person, or why are they not doing better in person, and why are they doing better or worse at home? So hopefully I stayed within those guidelines.
Dr. Pierce?
So I have two questions. The first question relates to, as we think about the presentation and feedback on just how that could be improved. I'm taking this to be that School Links graduation tracking will now serve as our graduation plan. That should be signed off by families and the student. Am I following this correct?
Yes.
Okay. So then what will be helpful is, as we're monitoring with your monitoring reports, we need to know in that tracking system, where are those milestone points at? Because it would be helpful to see those every quarter, every semester. So if there's a page, if there's a milestone point on there that, I don't know, by the end of 8th grade, we've checked in with the family twice, the student is enrolled in their high school classes, they have their schedule, and you can report to us, school starts in September. So if you could report to us that last meeting before we break for the summer to say, this percentage of all of our 8th graders have met the milestone, they're prepared to go into their freshman year. So what would be helpful is to know those milestones that we should be tracking in the monitoring report. So that's the first thing for this presentation, what's helpful. When we move to this monitoring report, I absolutely like the conciseness and brevity of the executive summary. Like, we don't need it to be any longer. In terms of the, I think, why questions, there's so many of them. There's 7 of us. Everybody's gonna have multiple why questions. I think what we have to figure out in terms of our board culture is, how do those questions not only get filtered to you and your team, but how do those questions get addressed, right? So for me, we can continue to bring these why questions forward, but I guess I'm like Carol. I want to move beyond the sound bites and see the actions that are going to get us to improvement.
Right.
Right?
Right. And that's going to come because we've already established what the board goals and guardrails are, and we're going to complete our monitoring calendar, so we know when that data will be presented.
So I guess another way of looking at it, even like on the last page of the executive summary, when you go to the moving forward, while the moving forward piece is good, maybe you could put 3 or 4 strategies there that you're actually going to implement, and that would be more in alignment to helping us monitor. Because then we could come back that following year and say, okay, not that this is an I got you moment, but this is transparency and accountability.
Right.
Last year you said these were the 3 strategies that you were going to employ. So when we come back that following year, no matter who's sitting at this table, they'll be able to say, how did strategy X, Y, and Z help those students move up in graduation? Right. And to me, I feel like that gets us to that why, those why questions, right?
One caveat with that. You do not want monitoring to become the occasion by which you get deeply invested in a particular program or strategy that the administration rolls out. Like, your evaluation as a board is always, did you get the job done for our students? Yes or no? And then what did you try? So imagine a scenario where the superintendent says, here are the strategies that we're going to deploy. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And then the superintendent leaves the board meeting, and a month later, they evaluate the data and they find that those strategies actually aren't effective. There's a whole different set of underlying root cause that actually imply a different set of strategies. The last thing you want to do as a board is give the superintendent any impression that there will be discontent on the part of the board if she didn't implement the strategies she mentioned, because then she's going to be more likely to stick to them even after she has data to suggest that they're the wrong ones. And so that's the only caveat. Is I think it's going to be appropriate to come back the following year and ask the question directly about the goals. What evidence do you have that we've accomplished our goals? And I think it's also appropriate to ask, hey, you had some ideas about strategies. What did you learn? Kind of which of those worked, what didn't work, and how are you going to deploy that going forward?
So I don't know,
What you-
AJ. I think I respectfully disagree with that, because what we know and what we see in our system of education is that we often don't stick with software strategies, resources to actually show sustained improvement for our students. So I would take it that it's on the part of our superintendent and leadership to bring those top strategies that we are going to maintain and use, that align with our goals and guardrails, that strategically align with our 5-year strategic plan, that we can show some fidelity in maintaining to improve student achievement. So what I would want to see is consistency. And what I'm about to get in class mode. What literature shows is that we should have consistency of resources that we're using to help students improve.
If it's the right strategy,
I
consistency,
apologize
consistently
for
doing,
going into
consistently doing the wrong thing is no virtue. And so, yes, if it is something that there's evidence that it's working, then absolutely, you would expect to see consistency in its application. But if the moment the superintendent has evidence that something is in fact not working for the students that you serve, you do not want to encourage consistency for consistency's sake. But you do, I agree, want to encourage consistency when there's evidence that something is working. But if they have evidence to the contrary, you don't want to be, as a board, you do not want to behave in a way that encourages them to continue doing things that don't work just for the sake of getting kudos from the board for consistency.
We agree.
Board Member Cole?
No, I just wanted to assert that I absolutely agree with that. I think it's incumbent of then the superintendent to be sure in the whys section that she demonstrates as to why that did not work, where there was systems failure. So I absolutely agree.
And that's a powerful learning.
Yeah.
That is a great conversation to have in monitoring. That's when monitoring is really powerful, exactly for that purpose.
Board Member Ragland?
Yes, when is it appropriate to have a conversation about rigor within the context of this particular goal? For me, I think the bigger picture is really kind of what we're missing here. And we've talked about culture tonight. We've talked about other things, but I think the culture is getting students to graduation, and I think we're doing an adequate job of that. But I think for me, with this goal being about increasing to 86% by August of 2026, I think we've got to talk about the rigor within.
So hold on to that question. There's a time for that. So right now, so the time for that is if you look on the sheet in front of you about progress monitoring student outcomes, read the sentence that describes after monitoring. That's when that particular issue becomes appropriate to bring up. As for right now, are there any other what worked or what didn't work specifically to something that took place in the presentation that might inform future presentations? If not, I want to get back to the actual role play so that you can actually dive into.
I have one, and then we'll move, because I don't know, AJ. We're only scheduled for this until 7:30. I don't know what you want to do, but I think this is really valuable so that we are all level set, so we know what we're doing.
Yeah.
But so for me, I agree with a lot of the comments my colleagues said about the why I always say the why. What's the why? So, but where like big things stick out, especially around equity, I really think that needs to be explained. So, for example, the regional data, I mean, Region 1 sticks out like a sore thumb, and that was just glossed over. And that's a huge equity question. And I think it just needs to be addressed. So, if there's some huge inequity disparity that's just on its face on the paper, I think that should be explained. I mean, the whole exercise is really one inequity because we're looking at the data and trying to figure out what works and doesn't and what's, but if it's that blatant that it's, at least 10 or more, 13, 14 more percentage points below every other region, like that seems like a big like red flag. So if there is a red flag, I want us to call it out and be like, here's the red flag. You need to hear what's happening in this area. And that could be in any of the other pieces of data, but that one in that regional one just stuck out to me.
And I agree with that. I just wonder whether we should also take a look at those that are particularly high and stand out for that reason and say, what are we doing here that's right that we can apply elsewhere? And I'm looking at Region 6.
Right, like there's a huge disparity, and that's, I know that those would be questions that, I would ask, but the presentation, you see it on paper. So what I'm saying in the presentation, it should address that, and then we can dig into it as a board during the monitoring session. But it'd be nice to know that you saw it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even data explaining some of it so that we can dig into that data.
And Dr. Dixon, I think it's, and I know there's a lot of ways you can present this data, so I'm just gonna throw this out there. And I think we talked about it the first time. We talked about, this is the number of, out of how many, right? So it can look low if you're talking 200 out of 1,000. But it looks just right if it's 200 out of 213. So, giving us context again of the data and how are you looking at it? I'm assuming, again, that you're looking at up, down, sideways, upside down. I'm sure you're looking at different ways of analyzing the data, but when you give it to us, I have it highlighted here. I got all this, I saw that also, but then when I sat here, I'm like, okay, but what's that out of? How many potential graduates from that region was that out of? It's out of the cohort.
Right.
It's out of the regional cohort, so that's why I'm concerned. It's not out of the whole.
No.
Right. Correct.
So a little
All right, so
disaggregation,
the-
it sounds like.
Yeah.
So the feedback, if I'm understanding, the feedback I'm hearing is just concerns around to what extent does the data effectively contextualize
What's happening in the region?
the goal, where we are relative to the goal, and where we are relative to the interim goal. And there's some concern that the data isn't sufficiently apples and apples to tell that story. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's great feedback. Any other feedback for
could-
the staff before we transition?
Yeah,
Remember Brown?
and maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, of course, but this report and the presentation seem to be pretty much presenting factual data. And there's not much analysis from the professionals as to why and what's significant and what's not and why these things mean this. More analysis would be good. It doesn't mean we have to accept necessarily
right.
all that analysis, but I'd like to see what our professional educators think about the data and what it shows. We'll see more. We'll see other things, and we'll have questions. But without the analysis and just providing raw numbers or percentages,
Doesn't give you
just
the
doesn't
picture. Yeah.
get me there.
Okay.
And I think sometimes it might make sense in certain pieces of data to also do comparison to other districts or national data. I think that I'm pretty sure our graduation rate is actually really good. COVID time, right? And so I think it's above the national average. So things that also put us in context with what's going on in other districts where it makes sense. I mean, if it's a strategic thing that helps us figure it out, I think could be helpful too. Raglan.
Yeah, I think that and maybe I'm just completely off base with this, but I think that's kind of where what I was getting at before, in talking about, what does this actually mean for students once they are
Yes.
finished here? What does our diploma mean when a student goes out into the workforce with our diploma versus a diploma from Hilliard or Gahanna or Pickerington, right? And when we have this data that shows us that our students have accomplished these goals here, they've got data that show that their students have accomplished their goals there as well. But what we're finding is that our students aren't getting the same results post-graduation as those other students from other districts. And what does that mean for us, right? What does that mean for our diploma, and what does it mean for the folks that will hire our students or accept them into college, or what does that mean for them when they're paying for either remedial courses in college or staying in college and persisting? I think maybe this isn't the time to have this conversation, but for me, this is about what our diploma really means, not just increasing the rate of the students that are graduating, but how are they going out into society and living and sustaining productive lives? And I don't think that we're having that conversation. I think we're having a conversation about getting students to graduation and saying, here, we've got this many kids that have graduated and this many pathways. But I
All
don't.
right, so I have a quick, please.
I'm sorry. Please repeat that, AJ. Excuse me.
I said I have a quick pop quiz for the board. Why is the conversation, so I think, Raglan, I think you very accurately described the nature of the conversation. So the pop quiz for the board is, why is that the nature of the conversation we're having right now?
Impact on students, student achievement.
Because that's the goal we picked.
Because that's the goal you picked.
That's our problem.
That is absolutely why the way you described it is spot on. That's exactly the conversation we're having. And we are, in fact, in not having this other conversation that you just lifted up. But the reason why is absolutely essential. The staff is following the leadership of the board. That is what they are to do, and that is what they have done. This is one of the other things I love about monitoring, is it begins to highlight for us kind of where what we've put in place does and doesn't seem to work for us. Now, that being said, once again, as before, the appropriate place for this conversation is after the monitoring. So you'll notice on the sheet in front of you, there's the before monitoring, during monitoring, after monitoring. The appropriate place for this is after the monitoring, but this is a very normal thing for monitoring to lift up, is you start to ask questions like, as a board, did we do our job as well as we could have? And if there's dissatisfaction, the man in the mirror has got a lot to say about it. But this is a normal part of monitoring. And so I just want to go ahead and use this as an opportunity to give you a caveat. This is the first, but I promise you will not be the last time over the course of the next 6 to 12 months that you are getting into the groove of monitoring, where you arrive at this conclusion that as a board, we have led our staff to a place that we did not intend. And so what I'm going to coach you on right now, write all of that down and be prepared to make adjustments, but do not attempt to modify your goals or guardrails anytime in the next 12 months. My coaching for you is live with what you have created, and go through one cycle That way you'll have an understanding of what does and doesn't work for you. And then a year from now, let's have the conversation about, are there tweaks that need to be made? But the problem is if you try to do it every single time you get this feeling, that's all you'll be doing for the next 12 months is constantly trying to make tweaks. And so hold on to this. This is the right feeling. This is the right thing to have surfaced. But hold on to those and be methodical about going through one full cycle first. And then about a year from now on our calendar, let's just build in an expected time to come back and make a decision as a governing team. Now that we've gone through a year of monitoring and we've learned a lot about what we intended, what we didn't, what worked, what didn't, about going back and making some adjustments. And by the way, that's a totally normal process to go through. I don't actually know of any boards that haven't got into the monitoring and then came to the conclusion that as a board, like if I knew then what I know now, I would have actually selected differently. It's perfectly normal, but just hold on to it. Have the discipline to sit with that while you get through a full cycle.
It also doesn't mean that the thing is not important or not being monitored elsewhere out of this context. Like these were the things that we chose. I remember, James, because you put that on the table, and we decided not to select that one as a whole at the time. And so it might be one, like AJ said, we come back and feel like, you know, we're making progress. The thing superintendent's making progress on this actual graduation rate thing. Now we need to lean into the measurement after, or the trying to develop it. So, but it doesn't mean that they're not doing it. And I just want to say that because we have really selected to lean in a very narrow scope, but we know that so much more is happening, and the staff all over is doing so many more things. And Talisa still has an obligation to report on different things to us in writing, and you know, so it's still happening out there. That kind of thought process.
Right.
So it's not forgotten. It's just that we've decided to spend this time really focused on these specific goals, because there's a lot on this paper that's not.
Right. And AJ, would that question that Board Member Ragnar raised, could that come out in when we get to the how or the future focus as a discussion? It won't even come out at all, so we have to stop
Hold on
it
to
and
that
then
question.
We changed the goal.
Hold on to that question for just a second.
Okay.
So we need to, you all need to transition because you have other things to do, because this was not scheduled to go much longer. So as a way of closing out, I want to come back though to where we began. So we didn't actually get into the role play, but that's okay. What we were doing is really learning about the process and getting understanding and clarity. So a few pieces of guidance, and then we'll dive into one thing. So we'll run a few minutes over, I apologize, but a few pieces of guidance. Administration, first, great job on your first outing. Really appreciate what you all put into it. Continue to bring the quality of work that you brought this time. A few pieces of guidance on this. One, I can't remember which board member mentioned it, but they were spot on. Anytime that you can help contextualize with third-party data, that's generally really helpful to give the board a lot more confidence in that you've really triangulated meaning appropriately. And so whether that is the Ohio perspective or whether that is the national perspective or NAEP or something else, or an example of you all doing this, which I found particularly valuable, even though we didn't see it, you all mentioned, hey, we went out and actually interviewed some pending graduates.
Right.
Like I think things like that in the pre-materials that you provide is going to be really valuable to the board. We're providing these third-party, whether it's the students themselves or other venues that are providing data that provide insights that help corroborate the interpretation that you all have arrived at. I think that's going to be really valuable. And so you started to lean into that, would certainly encourage you to lean into that more. In terms of one area to sharpen, as a result, actually, I'm going to hold on to that. We're going to come back to this in just a moment about the area to sharpen. One other piece of coaching is I want to distinguish between the pre-materials that you provide and the monitoring conversation or the monitoring report itself. So the monitoring report itself should generally be 1 to 3 pages, maybe 5 pages at max. You do not want the monitoring report to become this dissertation. You want it to be crisp, clean, to the point. And generally speaking, you want it to be accessible to your community, to your family members. And so I would make sure that in your drafting of it, that it meets that criteria. I would say the same is true for any pre-presentations that you provide. But the key distinction is that you want any type of presentation or contextualization or whatever that you provide, you want it to really help deepen the board's understanding of what is true for students, to the extent to which reality for students matches the expectation of the board. You want it to deepen into to where that's not the case, to what extent are we seeing growth? And you want it to deepen into whether or not we're seeing growth, or if the growth is not adequate to meet the expectation, what is taking place to get us closer to that? Like anything that can help lean into those three questions in the pre-material, I would focus in on try to focus in on those things and try to be really tight, really narrow in on that. In terms of the monitoring report itself, board members, as kind of our exit ticket, I want to ask you, board members, the 4 questions that need to be asked before you actually engage in monitoring. So question number 1, board members, as you look at this monitoring report, does it answer question number 1?
I think we can't see that, but we can read it. Yeah. Does it clearly show what is being monitored?
Monitor, yeah.
The goal. What is the what
Which
goal?
specific policy and goal, interpretation, et cetera?
No.
No.
No, I would suggest that the monitoring report does not accomplish question number 1. And so this is just something that is opportunity to tighten up, that you want to be very clear which goal and which interim goal specifically is being monitored. And I was not able to find that clearly articulated. I did find later on someplace where, I identified which goal, but not which interim goal. And so you want that to be crystal clear. All right, board members, question number 2. Is question number 2 addressed in the monitoring report?
Evidence.
And in some areas.
Well, not
Previous
really,
reporting
because
period,
the goal that we're
you know,
doing is the exact benchmarking to the graduation rate.
Yeah.
For over 3 years. Am I missing it?
So does it clearly show data for the 3 previous reporting periods?
I mean, we got a lot of breakdown, but I don't just see the general goal, the general percentage.
The correct answer is no.
It doesn't show the targets.
Yeah.
There were no targets.
Yeah, so I'm curious about what is the goal and what is the data specific of that, and what is the interim goal that we're looking at right now, and what is the data relative to that. And I wasn't able to find that clearly, so that's something that you're going to want to make sure is clearly present. And I would encourage you, for the purpose of making things as accessible to your families and community as possible, the use of some type of line graph that helps clearly delineate what is the trajectory. Are we in fact moving in the direction of our goals? Have we kind of flatlined? Are we experiencing some type of decline? All right, board members, question number 3 is question number 3 answered in the monitoring report?
No.
So I did not see it either. I felt like in some of the narrative there was some kind of allusion to it, but what you want to have is just crystal clear. I don't need to look to find it. It is very clear what does this data mean? And staff, I don't know what your internal progress monitoring systems look like, but whatever you use internally, you use the same thing here. So I wouldn't invent a new progress monitoring system specifically for this. I would just use whatever you use. So for example, in my last team, we used red, yellow, green. My cabinet would come to me with their updates, and each of their key initiatives would have either a red, a yellow, or a green dot next to it. And then we talked about from that. I know other teams, they use kind of on track, off track. So there's nomenclature, there's letters, stars, numbers, colors, whatever. Whatever you currently use as a senior cabinet for progress monitoring with your internal initiatives, that's what you already understand. So just use that, copy and paste that same thing for performance monitoring here as well. And then that brings us to the 4th question. board members, does the monitoring report address the fourth question?
I think it generally addresses it in the moving forward section. I think that's where it talks about, you know, what progress will be taking place to move the district forward. I think it's in that last, it could be, it's alluded to as we start this academic year, our counselors have already begun to develop individualized plans to guide our students to the completion of their graduation requirements.
Yeah.
So I think that there's again, a direct statement to that effect, but could be more definitive.
I think we need data.
Yeah.
We need to
Well,
say,
and so and that's the underlying issue. So I completely agree with you, right? I think that there is an effort to articulate
right,
not only kind of why do I believe the data, you know, is the way it is, but also what do I intend to do about it kind of at a really high level. But I think that winds up being much sharper and easier for the board to digest if they have first been able to do a deep dive into the data itself. And so just to put this in context, staff, in a normal monitoring conversation, the board is going to spend 2/3 to 3/4 of its time looking backwards at the understanding the data, trying to figure out what does that data mean, and which students are we talking about, just really getting clear that they have a full and complete mastery of what is true for students right now, and how did we get here, and why are we here, and what does it all mean? And then the remainder of their time, the smaller chunk of time, then invested in, okay, now what is your response? What often is the temptation is to skip over any type of analysis, any type of thoughtfulness, any type of deep dive into the data, and go straight to, okay, what's happening next? That is poor performance monitoring behavior. And so to support your board in the highest level of quality monitoring work, you want to make sure they have the access to the data. And then the sections in here that talk about what happens next, they actually have a context for, okay, now I understand based on this data why you're going this direction. Do not shortchange the data conversation. It is a harder conversation to have. It's a less comfortable conversation because you generally have less experience with it as board members and as staff having this conversation with board members. And so the temptation will be to brush past it and get through it so that you can get to the real work of talking about what are we going to do next. No, this is a measure twice, cut once type of situation. You want to be knee deep in the data so that when the superintendent says, and here's what we're doing next, you have the full context of, does that actually make sense based on the data that we just dug into? But if you don't dig into the data first, then as a board, you won't know if what you're being told as the strategies make any sense or not, or if it's just some good old okey doke. Like, you want to dive into the data first. Staff, you help set them up for success by providing that for them. So I know that we've run about 10 minutes over time, so I want to head back to Madam Chair. Here's some homework to do to prepare us for the next round of it. Again, this was absolutely perfect. You all are on a roll. You continue to just bring excellence and enthusiasm and student outcomes focus to the work, and I'm excited to be in this with you. So some homework to help level up. In advance of the next session, I would encourage not only the administration to then go ahead and iterate. Like, you've provided some quality work here, so now just based on the feedback that you've received from myself and the board, just gonna go ahead and iterate and add the next level of this based on what you've heard. And that's kind of the key thing for you all to do. In the next practice, ideally, we'll dive back into the same thing, but just with the next iteration of the documents. Board, that means because we'll likely dive into the exact same conversation again, you'll, as your homework, you'll want to take the existing documents that were provided. It's got some really great information. And even though it's not explicitly about what you have in your goals and interim goals, it's still something that you can practice building some questions around. And what I would further offer is, if you want some help in a little one-on-one session to dive into what's been provided and develop some questions around it, some practice with that, just reach out, and I or a member of my team will make time to visit with you on a one-on-one basis to do some of that question development so that you can be exceptionally prepared for the next round. But staff, make sure that that the presentation in advance speaks directly to the goals and interim goals at hand, and that all 4 of those questions are answered in the actual report itself. Board, just keep bringing that focus, that passion for what's possible for students. Madam Chair, as always, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, AJ. We definitely appreciate these sessions, and obviously, board, we will have more of them. Board Member Brown, do you have a question?
I do, and it's probably, in fact, I'm sure it's not for discussion tonight, but what occurs to me is that this board, from time to time, has turnover. Wide variety of possible reasons. Everybody here has bought into this process. Has hired AJ to work this through with us. We like the process, we've studied it, we've learned it, we've practiced it. How do we transition when we have some turnover on the board?
That's a super fair question, and actually part of our job is to create that new kind of orientation for new members, as well as our community. It's part of the monitoring
Implementation timeline.
calendar.
Onboarding.
So we have onboarding and we have community work as well, so that they understand what we do and why we do it. And so that's something that we'll be developing before the end of the year, so that we, when there is if there is a transition, we are ready. And new
Have you
people
all
feel
adopted the
comfortable.
new implementation timeline?
Sorry, AJ, I think I was talking over you.
As a board, have you all adopted the new implementation timeline?
Not yet.
So I would encourage you all to do so at your next meeting where you are doing board votes. And Eric, that is actually built into that timeline, that pre-boarding is better than onboarding. That if you want to operate at the highest level of effectiveness as a governing team, you will ensure that everyone who gets elected as a result of the next election was fully trained on monitoring and effective governance before they filed to run. You want to ensure
That's the
that
community
everyone who
Bones
gets
Jones.
sworn in, that they were fully trained prior to filing. That's what excellence in this work looks like. And yes, that is a high bar. I suspect that you all are more than equal to the task once you set your minds to it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Okay. Well, again, thank you, AJ, for all of your work. Thank you, board members. It's really important that we dig deep into this. This is critical work that we are doing. We are going to go ahead and move into our next item agenda, which is executive session. Madam Vice President, I believe you have the motion.
Yes, Madam President, I move that the Board of Education recess into executive session per Ohio Revised Code, Section 121.22, G4, to prepare for, conduct or review negotiations or bargaining sessions with public employees concerning their compensation or other terms and conditions of their employment.
That's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Beckerly,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Mr. Cole,
Yes.
Dr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Ragland,
Yes.
Vice President Reyes,
Yes.
President Adair.
Yes.
Motion carried.
Thank you so much. We are going to go ahead and recess into executive session. We will come back to the public session to officially adjourn the meeting.